go ahead and turn to the book of Ruth. It's a very small book. It comes after the book of Judges in the Old Testament. Judges is a bigger book, so you can probably find Judges and then go right after Judges, and you'll find the book of Ruth. This is our second lesson in the book of Ruth. We actually started about 3 weeks ago, and I was out of town. So to kind of get us into the second chapter, I want to kind of do a review of the first chapter. I knew there would be a youth event tonight. I figured we might have some folks that weren't here with us last time. So I'm going to spend a few minutes so that you'll know what we're talking about, kind of give you a background of Ruth and Ruth chapter 1, then we'll get into chapter 2. So the book was written about 1,100 years before Christ, about 3,000 years ago. It was written by the prophet Samuel. Samuel was also the last of the judges that ruled Israel after they came into the land of Canaan, which was after their 40 years of wandering, after their 400 years in captivity in Egypt. So he was the last of the judges. He was also a priest, and he was also a prophet. He was the one who would eventually anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. Then later he was going to anoint David as the second king of Israel. So he's a very important figure in the Old Testament. He actually wrote the book of Samuel. He wrote this book, and he wrote Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel. So he wrote 4 books in the Old Testament. So he wrote this book obviously by inspiration, as all the books in the Old Testament are written and all the books of the Bible are written, but he writes it through Naomi's eyes. So I kind of, we don't know, but we kind of think that maybe Naomi kind of told him this story, and kind of, because it's like the story is told as if she's telling it. And she relates these things to Samuel. And what's interesting, when you go back to the original Hebrew manuscripts, Judges and Ruth are actually all one book. They're put together. And so it's kind of important for us to kind of look at what was happening at the end of Judges to kind of tell us what's going on at the time of Ruth. And so let's do that. We'll start out. And what I've done is on your lesson sheets, all the scriptures we'll read tonight are on your lesson sheet in case you didn't bring your Bible or don't have it on your phone. So we start off with Judges, and actually Bandy, who does our audio-video, let me know that I transpose those 2 numbers. It should be Judges 21:25 rather than 25:21. So what we're going to do is read the last verse in Judges and then go to the first verse in Ruth, because in the old Jewish manuscripts, that's how it was. So let's read those 2 verses. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Remember we said this was a time of the judges. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And so this tells us at this time in Israel, we know that they had judges. So they had a system of judges, they had a system of courts, so they had a system of law. It wasn't a lawless land, but it said it was a time when still everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Now this was supposed to be a country under God. So what does this sound like? Kind of sound like America right now, doesn't it? One nation under God, and yet everybody's kind of doing what they want to, what's right in their own eyes. Everybody says, well, what's right for me is what's right for me. And that's kind of the attitude we have in America. Well, that was the attitude at that time in Israel during the time of the judges. And then it tells us that there was a famine going on. People were starving, probably a lack of rain. We talked about last time how famine could happen for several reasons, but the major reason was there was a lack of rain in Israel. And so when you have an agricultural society and everything is based on growing crops and having livestock and feeding them some of the crops so that you could enjoy the livestock, things get bad. There's not enough food for everyone. We had a drought here in southwest Oklahoma, I think it was 2011 to 15, and it was very difficult on our farmers and ranchers, but most of us did okay because we live in a modern age. We're not totally agricultural based, and we have shipping, and so food is brought in from everywhere. And so even though not much was being grown in this part of the country, it could have been a famine had this happened to us if we lived, several hundred years ago. Anyway, so in Ruth 1, it opens with a famine, and this man is named Elimelech, that we learn about in the future verses, and he takes his wife named Naomi, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and we presume they are probably upper teenage or young 20s, but they're single, and they go somewhere where they can find some food because they're starving. And I'm sure they were not the only ones, but this story is about them. And so I think you should have a map there. So to kind of make this more real, this is the map we showed last time, but I thought again we would show it again this time. Here you have the Mediterranean Sea, and then this is the country of Israel here. And then you see this sea down here. This is the Dead Sea. And so down on the very left-hand corner is the country of Moab, or your right-hand corner, I'm sorry. My left hand, your right hand. So on your upper left part of the Dead Sea is a little town called Bethlehem. You may see that. That's where they lived. And so this is about a 50-mile journey. So, Israel's not a real big place. So they apparently walk around the top of the Dead Sea and come down into the land of Moab. And so that's where this story begins. Now, to give you a little background on Moab, the Moabites were descendants of Lot. Remember the story of Abraham and Lot in Genesis? Lot was Abraham's nephew. And you remember in Genesis, they were in Canaan, the promised land, and they each had very successful farming and ranching operations where their flocks grew so big there wasn't enough land to supply food for all of the crops. So Abram says to Lot, we got to separate. Because we both have such big operations that we need to separate. And so you go where you want to go, and I'll take the other. And so you go east, and I'll go west, or you go west, and I'll go east. And the Bible tells us that Lot chose to go east because there was more rain. It was a more lush area. So that lush area was farther east across the Jordan River. And we know that Lot settled, later in Genesis, it tells us that he lived near Sodom. Remember that? Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember that story? Sodom was down here on this side of the Dead Sea in what we now call the land of Moab. So that's where Lot settled because it was a lusher area where he could feed his flocks a lot easier. Anyway, so Elimelech, one more thing about this picture before we leave the map. The Moabite stone. This is one of the great archaeological proofs of the Bible. This is in the Louvre, which is the great art museum in Paris. This was discovered by a missionary from Germany to this area in Moab in the 1860s, I believe. One of the tribal chiefs met this missionary and said, I want to show you something. And he showed him this. And this Moabite stone is an ancient writings from the time of 2 Kings, so a little bit later than the story we're studying tonight. But what it does, it's in the Moabite language, which is very similar to Hebrew, and it tells the Moabite version of what happens in the book of 2 Kings, and it mentions David, and it mentions the king at the time of the war they were talking about. So it parallels the Bible. So it's one of the archaeological proofs of the Bible. One of hundreds, literally hundreds. We studied that 2 or 3 years ago in here. Okay, so to continue our not so quick review of chapter 1, Elimelech and his family are in Moab so they can find something to eat. And so while they're there, he dies. And we don't know why he dies, but before about 200 years ago, in all of the earth, the average lifespan was about 40. So if you lived past 40, you were really lucky. So Elimelech dies. And then his 2 sons, the story tells us, Mahlon and Chilion, take Moabite women as their wives. And we know their names to be Orpah and Ruth. And so they take these women as wives, and then within 10 years, the two sons both die. So now we have Ruth, Orpah, the two Moabite women who had married these Jewish men, and we have Naomi, their mother-in-law, and they're all there together in Moab. So Naomi decides that she needs to go back home, and she tells these Moabite young women, stay here, this is your country. And at first, they both say, no, we're going to go with you, and Naomi just keeps on saying, no, you need to stay here, this is your country. You know, I'm old, I need to get home to my people. And so Orpah decides to stay, but Naomi absolutely will not let Naomi go home by herself. And Ruth makes a famous declaration of commitment to Naomi, and it's there on your lesson sheet, and it's one that we hear a lot in weddings because it's so appropriate for weddings. Ruth 1:16-17. Ruth replies, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. And so if you break this down, you see what's happening. See this commitment. It's really interesting. First of all, she's committing to a new land. She says, where you go, I will go. In other words, I'm going to forsake Moab as my land, as my home. Then she commits to a new life. She says, where you live, I will live. So she's forsaking her life with the Moabite people. Then she commits to a new lineage. She says, your people will be my people. In other words, I'm no longer claiming to be a Moabite, a child of Lot. I want to be a child of Abram. And then number 4, she commits to a new Lord. She says, your God will be my God. So she's forsaking the Moabite god who was Chemosh. And we talked about last time how he was a god whom they made sacrifices to, among which was their own children. Anyway, so she ends this with a kind of a no-limits pledge. She says, where you die, I will die. I'm not, in other words, she's saying, I'm not going back to my old life. She's just telling Ruth, this is the way, Naomi, this is what's happening. I'm going with you. I'm committing to you, to your life, to your land, to your Lord. I'm not going back. And so it's kind of like she's burning the bridge. You know, you've heard of burning the bridge before. Maybe, I've heard of people that would diet. You know, they want to lose weight. And so what they do is they get rid of their bigger clothes because they don't want to go back. So that's like burning the bridge. It's going to be a financial difficulty if you gain that weight back. So Ruth was burning the bridge when she makes her commitment to Naomi. Okay, so now they're back. They go back. So Naomi and Ruth go back to Israel. And then the end of chapter 1 tells us that when they walk into town, into Bethlehem, the women of Bethlehem hardly recognize Naomi. Of course, she's at least 10 years older, but, this has been a hard time. She's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons, and here she's with a strange young woman, and, I think she has aged more than the 10 years would have normally aged her. And Naomi ends, the story there ends in chapter 1. Naomi tells the women, no longer call me Naomi. Remember, in the Bible, names are very important. Naomi means pleasant. She says, no longer call me Naomi, but call me Mara. And Mara, as we know from Bible language, means bitter. Remember the waters of Mara that the Israelites came to when they left Egypt. So what Naomi doesn't realize at this time, I believe, is that, she's kind of blaming God for her troubles, and she really doesn't have a clue that God's using her in this situation to form a grand plan. And that's going to be kind of the theme of our lesson tonight as we go through this and see how God works through His people to accomplish His plans on this earth. And we don't always understand what He's doing in our situation while He's working. Okay, now we'll start in chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So I think as Naomi tells this story to Samuel, she's so excited, she kind of gets ahead of herself because we're not really ready for Boaz yet, but let's go ahead. The verse talks about him, so let's kind of talk about this a little bit. So we learn about Boaz before he actually enters the story. He was a relative of Elimelech, we're going to learn in a little bit, and it says he was worthy. Now, a lot of translations put wealthy right there. And one of the other translations I was reading said wealthy, and I thought, I know a lot of wealthy people that are scoundrels. So just because you're wealthy doesn't make you a worthy person. So I went to my Strong's Concordance, which if you will take the mentoring class, you will learn how to use to study your Bible. And that will tell you how that word in Hebrew has been defined the most in the Old Testament. And it's really interesting because it's used a lot in the Old Testament. It's used it's translated wealthy a few times, but the most times that word is translated army. Army. 51 times it's translated army. So the word actually is Haylil, H-A-Y-I-L in Hebrew, and Strong says it means strength, capability, skill, valor, and wealth. So you think about an army. Strength, capability, skill, valor, and wealth. So an army is powerful, it's forceful, it has what it needs to fight a battle, so that's the wealth. They will take on the task at hand, and they are leaders. I was never in the army myself. My dad was, but long before I came along. But I've never had a lot of personal interaction with Army people until just the last 2 or 3 months. I run the sleep center here for the hospital, and when COVID hit, Reynolds Army Clinic, Reynolds Army Base, Fort Sill, his Reynolds Army Clinic, they shut down their sleep center. They started sending all the soldiers with sleep problems to me at the sleep center. And so I've probably seen 30 or 40 of them in the last 4 months or so. And I am so impressed with every one of them. They are always, it's amazing. Most of us kind of drag in about the time an appointment is. They are, every one of them, every time is at least 15 minutes early. They sit up straight, they look you in the eye, yes sir, no sir. I mean, they are very confident people. I am so impressed with our Army. And I'm thankful to be protected by them. And I'm honored by them. So when you look at this verse here and you say Boaz was a worthy man, it's like he was an army of one. Have you heard that advertisement? An army of one. So this is a guy that everybody looks up to with strength, capability, skill, valor, and wealth. So wealth wasn't just the only thing that made him outstanding. So Boaz is kind of the guy in the area. Okay, verse 2. So Naomi kind of backs up in her story a little bit as we read verse 2. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I have found favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth is saying, let me go glean. So they are widows, and so they don't really have an income. And so what God allowed for in His Word, in the Old Testament, was for the poor to be able to glean. So what that means is they could go to the harvest, during harvest, they could go to the fields, and let's read Leviticus 9 and 10. This is what God told them, not Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field up to the edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest." That's what's been dropped. As they gather grain, you're going to drop some on the ground. He said, don't reach out and pick it up. Leave it there. "And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner." The sojourner would be the foreigner or the traveler that's needing something to eat. And so God has provided in the Old Testament the laws there for, and people in Ruth's time were following these, so that the poor, such as the widows, travelers, foreigners, had a way to get something to eat. And so the edges of the field were not harvested, and if they dropped something on the field, they would not pick it up. They would let the poor and the foreigners come in and pick it up, and then they would have something to eat. Okay, let's see here. So, it's interesting that they didn't, just a little byline here, they didn't say, God didn't tell the farmers to pick it up and go give it to the poor at their house. You see that? In other words, there's still responsibility. Okay, verse 3. So she set out, meaning Ruth, went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. The clan of Elimelech. When I read this, I thought, she happened to come to the field of Boaz. Now, like we just said, Boaz was kind of known as the guy, that everybody looked up to in the area, and I wondered, well, had she heard about this guy, and was she kind of inching over towards his land? Maybe she could kind of have, it's kind of like, back when you're in high school, and if you're a guy, was there some girl that you were kind of interested in, or vice versa, and you just kind of happened to stand by their locker and hoping they would think it was a coincidence? You know what I'm saying? You're doing it on purpose, but you're hoping they see it as a coincidence. So you just kind of happened to stand by their locker. So I thought, well, let's look up that word and see if this happened is an intentional thing by Ruth, or it's truly a God thing, as we would say. So let's see what this says. So first of all, I went to the King James. I want to see what, King James was done in 1608, 1609. I thought, let's just see what the King James says. And I put that there on your lesson sheet. King James Version says, her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging to Boaz. Anyway, so we go to Strong's, and that word there, hap or happened, means, this is great, to happen by destiny, to step into destiny. Wow, isn't that something? So this is truly not her intentionally going there because she had heard about this guy that was so great. Rather, she was just a foreigner. She was out there doing what she meant to do, which was to try to get something for her and Naomi, her mother-in-law, to eat. And she stepped into destiny. Wow. So what we're seeing here, one more time, this is not something Ruth planned. It's not something that she really understanding what's happening. It's an unseen force, God, who is directing her steps. She has committed herself to God, so now God is working with and through Ruth to bring His purposes on this earth to pass. This reminded me of Psalm 37:23. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when. There's a when there. There's not a period after the steps of a man are established by the Lord. That's not all it takes. God just doesn't come in and do it. There's a when. What does the when say? When He delights in His way. So when we delight, when our life is a delight in the way of the Lord, then He will direct our steps. That's when He will let us step into destiny like He did with Ruth here. We won't understand it. We won't know what's happening. We might not see the results of what we're doing till years later, or maybe something happens after our death. But when we delight in His way, then He directs our steps, just like He was directing the steps of Ruth. So Ruth steps on to the field of Boaz, and the course of history changes. She steps into her destiny. And so, you can kind of see Naomi telling this story to Samuel with tears of joy running down her face because she had been so upset with God when she came back to Bethlehem as a poor widow and when two sons were dead, and she just didn't really see much future. And then as she's now looking back on this whole story, she's seeing how God was working through every part of it. So that step was directed by God. He turned Ruth's story from gloom to glory. He changed Ruth from bitter to better. And he changed Ruth from just a poor, foreign, common widow eventually into the grandmother of King David and a grandmother in the lineage of Jesus. Amazing, huh? All because she gave her life to God. He worked through her to accomplish His purposes on this earth. He'll do the same with us. Verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." So here you have this Boaz, this worthy man, this army of one, and you see what kind of guy he is. He comes to his workers, and the first thing he says is, "The Lord be with you." This is the words a priest would use for his people to bless his people. And they obviously know what kind of man he is because they respond in the same way, "The Lord be with you." And so they know that he's a man of God, and they know that they're not just working for Boaz, they're working for God. And that should be our attitude in our jobs. In everything we do, we don't just have a earthly boss, we have a heavenly boss. And so, we need to take the attitude that Boaz did here, that, his world was his workers. Our world, is our family, could be our fellow workers, could be our friends. There's a world out there, but each of us has a world around us. We call this your circle of influence. And so, just like Boaz, you, me, can be an army of one for God. And so, we need to tell people, "May God bless you." Tell people, "I'm praying for you." That lets people know you stand with God, I stand with God, and we want them to be in that same circle. Jesus said, you need to confess my name before men. This is one way you can do it, is by letting people know that you stand with God. Your life stands with God. You want God to bless them and favor them, and you're praying for them. And in doing so, you want them to come into that circle if they're not there already also. So that's how we can be an army of one for God on a one-on-one basis. Verse 5 through 7. Then Boaz said to these young men who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So obviously this tells us Boaz didn't know anything about Ruth, didn't know who she was. He just saw how hard she was working, how much she had gathered, and so he goes to his chief worker and says, "Tell me about this woman. Who is this person?" And so obviously the head reaper, she had come to the head reaper and asked permission, like she was supposed to do, and he had given it to her. And he recognized that she was a Moabite, so he was obeying Leviticus 19 by letting the sojourner, the foreigner, glean in your fields. And he was obviously impressed with how hard a worker she was. So let's read verse 8 and 9. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." So obviously Boaz was impressed with the story that the chief worker had told him, and so he was impressed with what this Moabite had done for Naomi. Obviously he knew about Naomi because he was a member of the Elimelech's family, so he knew who Naomi was. And so he accepts her, he protects her, and then he even goes beyond the law and says you can even drink, rather than making her draw her own water from the well, says you can drink the water that my workers have drawn already. So he kind of gives her a little extra benefit there. And he wants her to stay on his land because he's so impressed with her. Okay, turn over your lesson sheet. Let's read verses 10 through 13. Then she fell on her face, this Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward will be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So Ruth is absolutely amazed at Boaz's offer and what he's done for her. His offer of provision, protection, and because she knew, the Jews and the Moabites were not exactly friends. And she knew that generally the Jews kind of tolerated foreigners to obey the law, but they really didn't go out of their way to make life easier for them. So she was really amazed that Boaz would do this for her. And he says, "The reason I'm doing this," she asked him why. She wants to know what's going on here. And he says, "It's because of what you have done for Naomi. And you have left your land, your life, your Lord, and you've come and become a part of Naomi's life here in a foreign land where you really don't know anybody." And notice there in verse 12, he says, "Because you've left your old life behind, God will give you a full reward because you have taken refuge under his wings." In other words, I can see, Ruth, that you're fully trusting in God to protect you, to provide for you in this new walk of life, in this new faith that you've taken on. This reminded me of Luke 18:29 to 30. Let's read that. "And Jesus said to them, 'Truly I say to you, there's no one who has left house or wife or brothers or parents or children for the sake of the kingdom of God, who will not receive many times more in this time and in the age to come eternal life.'" It's kind of like Jesus is almost talking about Ruth there, isn't it? What she left behind to go be with Naomi and to believe in Naomi's God, the God of Israel. And then one more thing I wanted to bring out was what Ruth said to him. She said, "I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you've comforted me." In the original Hebrew it says, "You have spoken to the heart of your non-Jewish maidservant." In other words, Boaz, you've really touched the center of my being. And what you've said to me about why you're treating me this way and what you've done for me with your provision and your protection. She's just saying, your generosity is overwhelming. Your kindness is overwhelming. I just can't believe what I'm hearing. This is just really, really touches me to my heart. Anyway, so we see next that Boaz doesn't stop there. And again, Boaz is a man of God. He's an army of one for God. So his steps, his words, are being ordered by God also, just like Ruth's are. And God's using Boaz to accomplish his purposes on this earth. And so let's see what happens in verse 14 to 16. "At the mealtime, Boaz said to her, Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her, and also pull out from the bundles the sheaves of grain, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." And so Boaz lets her eat with him and the workers, and shares their food and their wine with her. And then he tells the workers, "Let her follow right behind you, and as you're putting the sheaves in the grain, on purpose, pull out some and leave for her. Now, they didn't say, go let her sit under the tree and go hand it to her. She's still got to work, but make it a little easier on her. So he's giving her extra provision that he wasn't giving some of the other gleaners. Okay, verse 17 to 23. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, just to tell you, this woman's a hard worker. She went from morning till evening in the field. So that was probably 10 or 12 hours. And that's bending over, picking up for 10 or 12 hours. Then I guess she's got a little cart, because this is a lot of stuff. An ephah is about a bushel. So after she takes all this grain home, and grain's on a stalk, and then you have the little grain seeds. So she takes it home and beats it, to get the grain off of the chaff. And it says she has a bushel of ephah, which is about 8 dry gallons of grain. So picture a bushel basket full of grain and how much chaff that would represent. That's just phenomenal. I mean, this woman really, really worked hard. She took it up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She brought out and gave her what food she had left over. So she brings over leftovers from lunch, as well as the 8 gallons of the bushel, the 8 gallons of grain. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today?" She knows something's a little unusual. This take-home pay is a little bit high for a usual gleaner. "And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took care of you, who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Naomi recognizes right off that this is a huge take-home for one gleaner for one day, plus leftovers from lunch. So she's saying, where in the world have you been today? Anyway, woman, in southern Oklahoma, we'd say, "You've done good, girl." Man alive, wow. Anyway, so Naomi and Ruth said, well, the guy's name was Boaz. She didn't know anything about Boaz. She just, she happened to step into destiny. This wasn't planned. And Naomi's really excited because she knows Boaz. She knows all about this guy. I mean, this guy's got a reputation. Plus, he's a kinsman of her husband Elimelech, who has now died. And so, notice she said he's one of our kinsman redeemers. Let me just talk about that for just a second. There's several laws back in the laws of Moses, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that talk about this. And this term, kinsman redeemer, actually occurs 7 times in the Old Testament, all of them in the book of Ruth, when they're talking about Boaz and other people that fit his description who are relatives of Elimelech. So in the Old Testament, a kinsman redeemer, who's a relative of a husband that dies, or a relative of the family, could do one of 2 things. They could redeem either a relative who was in debt, who was now in servitude due to the debt. Back in those times, if you got into debt so deeply you couldn't pay it to another person, they could indenture you as a servant for so many years. The 7th year they had to turn you loose, or until somebody else had paid it off. So they could redeem a person, a relative who was in debt, who was now in servitude, or, all the families had some property. So if you had such a debt to somebody that you had to sell your property to pay that debt, Well, that land was considered still in your family, even though it was now owned by somebody else. And so a kinsman redeemer, if they had the money, could pay off your debt, and that land could come back to you and your family. So that's what a kinsman redeemer was. So she's saying that, Naomi's saying that Boaz is one of their kinsmen, and he happened to be this guy who is wealthy and well-known, and so she's excited about this because what we presume, it's not said here, but my guess is that, the famine came, and that Elimelech and Naomi and their family, in order to try to keep eating, got into debt, and that they lost their land because of debt, and that's one of the reasons they had to go to another country to find work and eat. And so I kind of believe the fact that Naomi and Ruth don't have anything, they don't have land to lease out. That's why Ruth's having to glean. And we kind of have to assume that Naomi is older and just not able to do the physical work of gleaning. And so that's why Ruth's doing it for both of them. But I think that's one reason Naomi is probably so excited right here, because she's thinking we can get our family land back if, Boaz will redeem this for us. And that's one of the things that Naomi's excited about, besides the possibility of maybe Boaz and Ruth. Okay, so that's how chapter 2 ends. So let's kind of put this all together. And so what we've seen in this chapter is Ruth and Boaz. We see two people that are committed to God and His way, and as a result, God works through them to order their steps to accomplish His purposes. And, they don't really understand it at the time. They're just walking step by step, but they're walking by faith. They're doing what their faith tells them they need to do, walking one step at a time. But God is working through them to His end in this world. I recently read a book that's kind of interesting. I shared it with Pastor. It's called God and the Pandemic, recently released by a man named N.T. Wright. He's a noted New Testament professor and translator out of Britain, and pretty well respected. I'm not here saying you got to read this book, but there's things in there I agree with, things I disagree with, and anything that man writes, you're free to disagree with. But there was one thing in his book that I thought really, as I studied this, I read that book about a month ago, I thought back to what I read in that book that really applied in this story here. And he spends several pages talking about Romans 8:28 and how he believes maybe there's a better translation than what maybe we're used to when you go back to the Greek. So Romans 8:28 is that famous verse that we hear a lot, especially when something bad happens to us. And the way it's usually translated in most of the English translations, it says something like, all things work together for good for those that love the Lord. You've heard that before, haven't you? And we say that a lot, especially when things are being hard for us, because it kind of gives us some hope that and comfort that when bad things happen, that God's going to make them okay in the end. And that's certainly a good thought. Well, Mr. Wright points out, kind of convincingly, that yes, that's a good thought, but if you look at the verses before and after, that kind of is out of context. And we've talked before about how you need to always interpret the Bible in view of context. But also, what really struck me was when he looked at the Greek word for work. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament was written in Greek. And most of the translators have translated the word work from the Greek word working for the benefit of. So God's working for our benefit to make all things work together for good. But he says that's not the Greek word that's used in the original manuscripts. Rather, the Greek word that's used is synergio, where we get our word synergism, means working together. Synergy is when things come together and do even greater things. And so he's saying working with is a much better translation of that verse. And so the translation that we have already in hand that comes closest to that is the Revised Standard. And I put that down there. God works for good with those who love Him. So God's working with those that love Him to create good. And so Mr. Wright would say it maybe could go something like this. God works with His people, synergistically, to get done what He wants to get done in the world. So I bring that up because that's kind of what's happening here in Ruth, is that, Ruth and Boaz have given their lives to God and renounced, any other god. And so their steps are being ordered by God. They're stepping into destiny, but they don't know it. But God's putting them in situations, putting them in conversations, because He has an end in mind. And that's that Ruth and Boaz will be the grandparents of King David, but even more importantly, Jesus will come through their lineage. They have no clue about that at this point. Of course, they're never going to know about, while they're on earth, about Jesus. I don't know if they're still alive when King David comes around or not. Anyway, so the point being that we need to put ourselves in the same place. That God works, when we give our life to God, when we are committed to His way, not just Sunday Christians, but our life, 7 days a week, is committing to being an army of one for God, then this walk by faith, God will step us into our destiny, not just for our good, but to accomplish His purposes in this world. And we may never see the end of that, but that's how we become God with us, Emmanuel, working with us for His purposes in this world. We become God's hands, God's eyes, God's feet, God's tongue. And sometimes we don't even know it. We don't know the influence we're having on people. We don't know what's going to happen to somebody's life because we said something, because we did something, because we went somewhere, because we gave something. But we just do it naturally because we're just doing what we feel like God wants us to do. And yet we're stepping into destiny. We're just happening to do what God wants us to do. And so you see, none of us as Christians are just living random lives. Your life is not random. Your life is not just inconsequential. If you're a Christian and you have set upon your life to be God's army of one, to be His man, His woman, your life will not be inconsequential. He has promised He will order your steps. Isn't that great? Doesn't that make you feel like your life is worth something to God? Because God uses you to accomplish His purposes on this earth in your world. The people, not somebody across the world you never met, but each of us has a world. Each of us has a circle of influence that God can accomplish His purposes in our little world, and we may never see the results, but that's not what's important. What's important is that we're working for God because He works through us when we commit to Him. Anyway, that's what I see in Ruth and Boaz, but that's also what I know that each of us can be. So I want to encourage you to be that, to be an army of one for God. So that's Ruth 2. A couple of weeks we'll look at Ruth 3 and then Ruth 4. A great little story. You ought to read it. This takes a few minutes to read, and it's one of the greatest short stories in the Bible. A great love story, and as I pointed out last lesson, it's a great love story, but the word love is never used in the whole book. But you see love throughout the book. Anyway, thank you for being here. Good crowd tonight, and I'll be back 2 weeks. I think Pastor will be teaching next week. If you're new to this class, he and I tend to tag team every other Wednesday. So if you don't like what you heard one Wednesday, it'll be different the next Wednesday. Anyway, but he's been doing a great series on Daniel, and he's in the prophecy chapters of Daniel, which are phenomenal. I was telling him the other day, I've studied the Bible a long time, and some of the stuff he's bringing out I've never heard before. So come next Wednesday, and then come back the Wednesday after that for Ruth 3.